Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our live Q&A session for disaster recovery for SAP on AWS. I'm Patrick Osterhaus. I'm Chief Technology Officer for Protera Technologies, and I'm happy to share this information around how we can set up disaster recovery solutions for the AWS environment for your SAP systems. A little bit about our agenda here today. We're going to be talking a little bit, giving a background around Protera Technologies and why we feel that we have the experience and our knowledge to share with you on this very important topic. And then we'll dive right in with how we can architect DR solutions for AWS for running SAP systems. We'll also take a look at a customer use case scenario, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for all your questions on these topics. So to start off, we'll talk a little bit about the background of Protera Technologies and give you a little short information, some information around how we got to developing solutions around DR solutions on AWS for SAP. So started back in 1998. We're coming on to our 20-year reunion here next year, and we're headquarters here in the Midwest in Chicago, Illinois. We have offices based around the world. So we have offices in Asia Pac, in Europe, Latin America, and of course, United States. And our focus is to provide ITO services for the mid-market for focusing on total solution for SAP compute and moving that compute into the cloud. So we've been working, as you can see here, our certifications span over 5 areas within SAP. We were just given the global, or I should say we just earned the global certificate last week from SAP that will be published very shortly. That audit took over 3 months, over 3 continents for us to earn that and to show our capabilities, not only in the hosting space, but around cloud, HANA, application management services, and mobile. And you can also see our certification and the tight integration we have with AWS, with Amazon Web Services, and our longstanding relationship with AWS to provide SAP solutions on their cloud and take advantage of their latest innovations that they continue to bring into their cloud solution, and then we continue to pass that on to our customers, as well as tight integration with SUSE, which you'll see here in our architecture of DR solutions, especially around HANA, is an integral piece with SUSE and their latest innovations in that space. We'll spend a few slides here talking about our offerings. So DR is part of our solution we call AppCare. AppCare can be considered our platform. And we've been doing, there's a new term in the industry around cloud brokering. We've been doing that exact service for many years, including doing the work back in 2011, starting when Amazon got certified by SAP as an infrastructure provider for SAP systems. So we've been doing it for quite a long time. We wrap our services in this platform, what we call AppCare, to provide application management services for any SAP product that is offered. So we can provide that service on-premise at a customer location. We can integrate that into a hybrid solution where we take that customer solution and extend it into the cloud, into AWS, and we will fully manage that. So we provide a help desk, 24/7 support, follow-the-sun support. And we provide the full suite of monitoring, change management, incident resolution, and then all the essential pieces of managing an SAP environment like backup, SAP DR, which we're going to talk about here today, set up HA, and doing all the proper care and feeding to run a world-class IT organization. Our certifications also include SA16. We're audited on that every year. So all these areas around the best way to do backups, the best way to integrate security and make security as part of the design within a solution, that's an integral part to our solution. So that's part of the AppCare package that you'll see in a couple slides how we provision this. And lastly, our differentiators, as I mentioned, we're staying on top of the SAP roadmap, where SAP is going. Public cloud is certainly a big portion of that roadmap that SAP is focusing upon. And we're also staying in the space of the HANA and the S4 migrations. And we have a separate webinar I encourage you to listen to. It's on YouTube if you Google that. That's based specifically around the FlexBridge migration. And we're offering here for the attendees here today on today's webinar, you can get a free assessment, and you'll see that at the last slide here on the deck. So a little more drilling into this AppCare platform. What we provide in the middle is all the care and feeding, all the very important areas to run SAP in a world-class IT organization. So it includes the stack, so the infrastructure as a service, all what's provided through AWS with the infrastructure, the networking, the operating systems, and also the monitoring of those services, and then going up the stack to monitoring, backup, DR as we see, and all the support desk capabilities and those features. So the ticketing, the SLA, the operations dashboard, all these are built in. So our service is packaged on a monthly basis for providing a full SLA on the cloud for all these services from SAP. And you can see some other packages that we fully support, not only just the SAP applications, but also integrating all these touch points that SAP will use in their solution. So operating systems, applications like Office 365, as well as Active Directory, which is an integral part for the security setup in a landscape. As I mentioned, we take very seriously our partnerships with SAP and also with AWS, and staying lockstep with where cloud and where the industry is going. So we take these best, the best of this solution in cloud and the features set that it provides, and we bring that to the SAP customers so they can run their SAP systems with these attributes. So the most flexible, where we can provide the full suite of applications that SAP provides and supports in AWS, we provide those full support. And we provide the scalability and agility, so we can quickly provision systems and bring those up and down. So those systems are only used or provided or up when they are needed, and we can capture significant cost savings to the customer and pass that on to them. And then, as I mentioned, building security and from the ground up. So within the full stack, having security built in the design, and have us monitor it with our SA16 practices. So incident management's built around this, threat detection, all this is built into the solution using the best offerings of the cloud technology. So as I mentioned, 20 years in, we've done a lot of migrations, we've done a lot of implementations, done a lot of design. So we bring this to bear every time we build a new SAP system, or the systems that we inherit from other providers. We'll take those over and we'll bring in our best standards to apply and get those enforced in the system so they're run at optimal, with the optimal feature set and the best performance. So it's within the design, the deployment, which is the migration and implementation, and then also the run. So the optimization after go live and building up any advanced features if the customer doesn't have those ready, like DR, which we're talking about today, HA, and taking advantage of the cloud features for doing backups and improving the time to do backups and restores, as well as the cost around that. So to switch gears here a little bit, we talked about our AppCare platform, and I'll introduce this idea on FlexBridge a little bit later. That's around the migration space for going to HANA and going to cloud with AWS. And lastly, we still do professional services. This is how our company started. We certainly will take on projects that it's important for customers to hit these migration deadlines, as well as the move to cloud. We're happy to help in those areas. So just wanted to show our lines of business and how we can help customers. So we're going to change gears a little bit now and focus upon our focus topic here today. And this is part of our AppCare portfolio of services around DR. So when we started working with AWS back in 2008 for our demo systems, and then 2011 when AWS was certified, one of the key features of looking at cloud was around disaster recovery. And I still believe this is the best area. If you haven't used cloud or AWS for your SAP solution yet, this is a great place to start. It's wonderful because it's a very low-cost solution that you can bring a lot of new capabilities if you don't have DR today. And it brings in inherent features of the cloud, which is much more efficient and it's better well-suited in the cloud. And these are 3 examples around those specifically. So if we look at the legacy methods of doing DR, you used to have a failover site. You may have your production in one environment, and then 100 miles away at least, you would have another site, and that's where you put your non-production footprint. And then you would do failover testing, DR testing every so often. You bring those non-production systems down, and the big concern there was around capital spend and having hardware that was utilized when you weren't testing the DR system. Yet it was, you had to basically build a like environment, so your cost was 2x, and you try to figure out ways you can mitigate that cost, but still it was a tremendous cost to have DR and keep it continually built at the same size of production for every system in DR. So it was typical that we would only see the most important system like the ECC system be DR, but these other subsequent systems like BW, CRM, they were second tier applications seen in the company, and many times they didn't have DR for them. So the nice thing about putting DR into the cloud with that low cost and very easy way to replicate between your on-premise, or if you're in cloud already going to AWS, is that you can bring these advantages of the cloud, which we saw in that previous slide, the agility, the efficiencies, and we can apply that here to DR. So these three points here on the features are really, really important to consider. So the really nice feature we'll talk about first is around scale up, and that is the idea, and we're going to talk about how we replicate later. There's a slide, and I'll go into all those details from a summary standpoint. We don't go into a lot of detail on the options. That'll be possibly a future topic for a webinar. Yet for the scale up, when the system is replicated to a target, what's really nice is you can have that target environment, which AWS considers a pilot light. You can have that size very small, because the only purpose for that pilot light for that small system is just to keep replication going. When you need to do a DR test or a DR event occurs, you can spin up and scale up the size of that server to the production size. And you could scale it out, meaning you could add additional compute, additional app servers if needed, if that's what production had. So it's a really efficient way to run a DR, have it always consistent, have it replicated, yet not pay for that 24/7 when really you only need to test it 1% of that time, throughout the year. The other nice thing here is the replication with the smaller footprint. So similar to the scale up, basically we can do copies of that environment at any time. So when you have this pilot light running and it's 24/7 being replicated, now you can use that DR environment for not only DR tests, but if you have a support package going into production, and now you usually would replicate production back to quality, you would use this test of the DR system, that same process you test DR, you can use that now to copy production. So this replication can be used not just for DR and doing multiple concurrent DR tests, you can also do production tests from that. So it's a wonderful, nice feature with no additional cost. And lastly, and this is probably the most important part when we talk about DR, from a functional standpoint, not talking about cost savings, but from pure functional what cloud provides, one of the best magical things AWS has is the availability of regions around the world. So you have many regions. You can choose if you want to replicate into another country. So many regions around the world. So this is going to provide and minimize your geographic risk if there's some kind of event that affects a whole region of a continent. You can protect that, and you can even have multiple sources of DR. With the cost that it takes, the incremental cost to build DR, it's certainly an option now. In the past, I can't remember an example where we had multiple DR sites being replicated. But this certainly is an option here going forward. So to summarize, or to introduce, let's say, the idea of where we can replicate from, pretty much everything's gain. How we would do this might differ, but most likely all these environments, with what you'll see is the methods of how you can synchronize, these are all supported between going from an on-premise, so a customer-hosted data center SAP solution, you can easily replicate that to AWS. Or if you're already in the cloud with another provider, you could replicate that system to AWS. And lastly, you can replicate AWS to AWS. So those are all certainly options. And AWS to AWS has a feature that can be supported. If you don't want to do replication, there's an easier way that you could do with backups, and I'll talk to that on that slide. So before we go into how DR can be set up in AWS, it's good to have a good survey slide here, a good intro slide of what an AWS instance looks like. And these are some nice stencils that AWS provides. So universally, everyone knows if you look at these icons, what they mean. But if it's the first time you're seeing it, I'll provide a quick intro on this. So we can look at those dashed lines. We can think of that as a landscape. And you can see there the availability zone. Now, that availability zone, we can think of that as comparable to a data center. And you can see in this example, you have the DR system that is set up here in it says availability zone A. It's actually a different region. That's actually a typo on the slide. What it should be is you would want to replicate your DR into another region. So you'll see that better presented here in another slide that's coming up. But the point being is that we separate. You see the graphics of the orange squares. That's the compute. Those are the servers. When you think of RAM and CPU, that's the squares. You have the storage, which are the red rectangles. So we're going to obviously have to, those two go together to make a server. So we have to replicate the storage. And then you can see these other icons here, which is the S3, which where you can back up to. There's another magical area of AWS Cloud, which is the snapshots, which is a great feature, especially around DR, to quickly copy systems. And that's we talked about scaling out and copying that landscape. We use the S3 snapshot technology to do that. Another important piece which you're going to see coming up is around the requirements of SAP running on AWS. We certainly need a secure network, and that is provided by the VPC, that virtual private cloud, that icon there. It's the orange. I'm not sure what it's representing, but it's some kind of cube. So we'll go into, that's the basic introduction here. Let's go into the next slide here, and that's going to be a little more sophisticated. It's really busy. But the key point here, and this is a better representation of what a DR system would in true look like. You can see here on the orange square there, the rectangle on the left, that's US East. That is the region it runs in. 1A is the data center, or what's called an availability zone. The key point here is we can see that full landscape is running in one region, and that's the sandbox, dev, and quality, and then we have production. And the interesting thing that looks a little complicated here with these dashed lines, what we're showing is SAP provides a very low-cost solution for HA, and it's called EC2. EC2 stands for Elastic Cloud Compute. That is essentially the Amazon AWS cloud. The EC2 auto recovery provides a heartbeat that checks to see if the hardware is down. And if that hardware is down on an instance, it automatically fails over to a like instance. So this is part of the part of the AWS infrastructure, and it can be enabled for free. So there's a few additional steps you have to set up in the monitoring, which is called CloudWatch. Once you set up CloudWatch to monitor if that system's down, you basically just say, set up a trigger to set up the new instance and get it running. So it's a wonderful feature that's free. Every instance, at least production systems, should have that enabled. So the key part here in this slide is that shows the representation of going to the DR system, which is in a completely different region. We selected here US West, 1A, which is in California. So the example here is US East is in Virginia, US West is in California, and we have a separation of those DR system from production over the country. And we extend the idea of the EC2 auto recovery even to the pilot light. So if that pilot light, which would for some reason go down, it will instantly recover on another copy of that system. And you can see how that's done is if you see these dashed lines meet in the middle where you have that storage, that red rectangle, the sharing of storage is what enables that auto recovery to happen. So it's a very nice feature. Again, it's free, and this is something that you have to pay quite a bit of money and have additional storage, like-for-like storage, 2x storage on an on-premise solution, and you're getting this for free. So to extend this idea, and this is one of my favorite slides to talk about the AWS solution. When we talk about when we talk about DR, we actually, there's a close integration here with HA, and some of the technologies that are used can be blended to provide some functionality to each. And this slide, to do it justice, requires a good 20 minutes. Yet, what we can see the same idea that came up in the last slide, the EC2 auto recovery, where you can see that represented as number 1 in the gray, that is provided for free. And then you can see some of these other areas as disaster recovery is shown in the lower left square here. You can see number 2, number 3, 4, and 5 all provide disaster recovery scenarios that are provided. This is specifically for HANA. So really nice slide. There's webinars specifically from AWS in this. Some great information. So this is a good place to refer to when you're looking at HA and DR for the whole solution. So what I want to do is I wanted to summarize these options that are provided today in the market for doing replication. And this is for specifically around DR. So the first one we'll talk about, and this is, I'll say, the most encompassing, is replicating the database and the operating system. So you can see here with this number 1 option, the database changes are captured and encapsulated within database logs. So this is one of the oldest methods of how you would do a DR system, is you would replicate the database through the log changes of the database, and also replicate any operating system file changes. So this one actually considers both the blue, which is database, and operating system. So you'll see actually in the case study we have later, this option we use for a system that is from 1997. So we can do DR, even though SAP no longer supports the version of SAP and Oracle no longer supports the database, we were able to provide a working, fully functioning DR solution for a customer, still live today, with doing this method. So it requires a little more setup, because there's some custom scripting that has to be set up to make sure the health checks are working, optimizing and making sure the performance is good, making sure the network connection doesn't drop. If there's a failure, how does it get remediated? All these things have to be built. There's third-party tools that do provide this. This is something that we, Protera, always provide, as a custom, or sorry, not custom, a standard DR solution. So this is certainly an option. This is where the industry started with, at least for SAP DR, and certainly is viable still today. Now, there is some new options available with third-party products that replicate the server changes by using an operating system agent. So what this does is it actually replicates. You install a program onto the operating system, and primarily these work more for Windows systems for the third-party companies we've seen and reviewed and tested. There is some Linux available solutions, and most of these are x86. It's really important. I should note here that the target in AWS has to be x86 based. So that target has to be either a Windows server or a Linux server. So many flavors of Linux, which are supported by SAP, those are possible. Our preference, as I mentioned before, is SUSE for the target Linux system to run on AWS. And so there's some options there on third-party solutions, how you can replicate the server changes. And the way this is done is through Windows, there's DSS, where it makes changes, it stores this in memory, it's replicating that in the operating system. The restrictions here is there's many operating systems it doesn't support, not only Windows, but even within the flavors of what versions of Windows it supports, as well as what versions of Linux it supports. So it is quite restrictive. In my opinion, it does not work as good as number 3, which is replicating the storage changes by using a VM, by using the VM hypervisor. So there's third-party products out there that would replicate at that level. So this is below the VM, below the server. So the changes that are occurring on the VM, it's actually capturing those changes and sending those over to AWS. So that's nice because it's providing always a consistent replicated copy, in the cloud. So very, very important, neat technology of how it's done. So these are all certainly options. What HANA provides us is replication of the data. So it actually builds in within the SAP platform of HANA and S/4HANA. It's going to replicate the data of anything that's changed in that system. It's going to send over and automatically replicate it to the target. So this is yet another way that DR can be set up. If it's a HANA system, we can replicate that at the application level. So really nice options. There is one here that's not listed, which I did refer to before, and that's using AWS snapshots. So if you are going from AWS to AWS, if your backups are done to AWS snapshots, you can then send the AWS snapshot over to another region, and that can be used for DR. And the RTO, RPO will not be as good as any of these options here, yet it's a good way, inexpensive way to provide a DR solution with a little higher RTO, RPO, yet you have the protection that if a region event occurred and that production system was affected, you could somewhat quickly bring up that target system and it would be fully consistent and supported by SAP. So in summary, we talk about SAP DR and AWS. The important pieces here is lowering the cost, the ability to perform those non-disruptive DR tests, which is can't emphasize enough. In the old model, if you actually had to do our DR test, you actually stop replication, and if DR occurred at that point, you would be live on that version that you started with of that date, whatever when those systems are spun up. So the beautiful thing on doing the DR and AWS is that we can keep the DR synchronized at all times, copy off from that pilot light anytime to bring up a test environment, and quickly be able to do DR testing and ensure DR is consistent and available at all time. And then the point here on the resiliency and redundancy is all the AZs, those multiple data centers in the regions around the world. So there's so many choices now. The choice could be how many DR targets do you want? So you can have more than one. It's really easy to have many regions around the world and provide protection across any kind of natural disaster that could possibly occur. And again, this AWS snapshot. So the hidden benefit of doing DR in AWS is that you have a very, very cool mechanism where you can create copies of prod very, very fast. So that's a really nice feature, and it's something that our customers take advantage of once they have it. This note probably could come up at the beginning of the slide deck. I should move it up. These are all requirements for you to have DR in AWS. You have to treat DR just like production, because someday, hopefully not, but someday your DR system may become production, so it has to be fully supported. These are the requirements for that. This note on the top has all the details, yet the important pieces here that you have to have AWS Premier support. This includes enterprise or business, and this provides an SLA with responses from AWS to look at issues in the infrastructure which might be related to problems that affect SAP. So you need to have that. And then you also need to do some enabling of SAP monitoring to be able to tie into the AWS cloud stack. So you need to enable some monitoring, as well as there is some network and storage requirements for running SAP there, especially around HANA. So you want to make sure you got that note and you're complying to all the requirements in there. Most importantly, I can sit up here and talk all day about things you can do, but most importantly, it's got to work. And here's the proof that it does work, and it works extremely well with AWS. So, to give due respect, I'd have to spend quite a few minutes for each one of these slides, and I want to get to Q&A, so I'll try to give a nice quick summary for each implementation, and then I'll go into the case study here for DR. So within this slide, we have three really cool projects, really cool companies. We have Fitch Ratings, which is doing, right now they're in the midst of doing their production SAP HANA migration. So they're going from SAP Business Suite, they have ERP with BobJ and Soulman, and they're migrating those systems, their full landscape, over to AWS. So they are using our tool, Protera FlexBridge, which we do not have in this webinar. I'm going to provide at the very end a way to get a free assessment. So it's a really cool implementation, and we'll have a lot more information on that in the case study coming very shortly on that one. The next two here are Gulfmark and Pacific Drilling, and both these companies have migrated their on-premise solutions into cloud. Gulfmark is running their SAP Business Suite, and they have a full production landscape in AWS and many non-SAP systems in AWS. And this environment, we've spent we optimize the spend considerably in AWS of how they're using their systems to get their monthly spend down dramatically. So really nice, good track record with the cost savings and how compute, especially around SAP, can be run in AWS. And same story with Pacific Drilling. This is more recent. This just went live actually last weekend on AWS, the migration with the Business Suite on HANA running on AWS. ArcLight is significant. They went live in 16 weeks on S4. So that's a West Coast cinema. They're expanding throughout the country. Great success story with one of our functional partners. For our candy companies, a really interesting use case. They actually have hybrid cloud. So they have business objects on HANA in AWS, and that system replicates and gets the data feed from on-premise ECC. So a really nice hybrid case study showing that over the cloud, you certainly can do on-premise to the cloud integration, and that's seamless to the customer. We also have the case study for MB Coatings. This was actually one of the first FlexBridge migrations we did. They did their ECC migration to HANA about a year and a half ago. So really nice POC. There's really nice value that was captured on that, and we have a separate webinar on that. That's part of the FlexBridge presentation. These next three are a myriad of different use cases. We have Merrifield, which actually was one of the very first, if not the first, production SAP system in AWS running for SAP. There's a video on YouTube on that one. Really good success story. It shows the merits of the scalability, the elasticity, I should say, of the cloud, where you can bring systems up and down. As there are seasonal, the garden centers, they have a lot of demand within the springtime, so they have to add additional compute. So it's a very good use of the AWS cloud to scale up resources very quickly when needed. And then we have Midwest Tape, which is a great example of DR. So more complicated environment. They have good size ERP system. They actually have integration with a really cool solution they have custom built, which provides on-demand viewing of movies and shows for libraries. And they built that within the AWS infrastructure. So taking advantage of the capabilities of streaming, much like Netflix, they provide a solution for libraries around the country. And we host and we manage the systems that integrate to the AWS solution they've built. So really nice success story. Really, really cool technology they've built and integrated to the SAP system. And then also Tableau software. These are the demo systems that they use for all of their prototypes and conferences that they show that they run in the AWS cloud for their software they build for analytics. And then lastly, last reference slide here, both these companies use AWS as a target for DR. Harvey has a very, very large DB2 database replicated to AWS. I believe that system is over 4 terabytes now, and the replication works extremely well. They do DR testing to bring up that large system, and it happens within a couple minutes to be able to copy that over in AWS. So really nice use case there. And then the last example here, and then we'll go into Q&A, is around this case. And as I mentioned in the scenarios before about ways you can replicate the system, this case we built was the very first system that we did production for DR as a target to AWS. And the most interesting use case here is that it is a 3.1i system and it runs in Oracle 9.2. So those environments didn't have native capability to build a DR target within Oracle. So all this had to be custom built and scripted, but we were able to do DR even in that scenario on the cloud. So in old versions of software, it actually gets harder to integrate that with the new technology than easier. So even though there's not as much features, it's actually a lot more complicated to implement that. And that's been live for a good 5 years now. So it's quite a success story. It shows that in any kind of use case, we can get DR to work in AWS, as long as that target environment supports AWS. And one last thing I'll finish here on this case study, this success story for DR, is around the building of this environment is all through VPN site to site. So the Viscase company has an MPLS that connects their corporate network to our data centers, yet the connectivity from their corporate network to AWS is a VPN site to site, and our connectivity for our management and all the replication is done through a site to site. So it's a very low cost solution, not only in the compute and in the cloud solution, but also in the connectivity, the networking. So it's what this solution with AWS for DR, it lowers pretty much any barrier in the past for a company to do DR. It's a matter of just getting it set up and setting up the replication. So any question on that, please reach out to us. We're happy to help and we get DR set up so all customer systems are protected in the cloud. All right, so we can finally get to what we wanted to talk about here, and this is our Q&A. So I'll open this up, or please feel free on the top. You can click on the Q&A button, submit any questions you may have on DR. There's a few that popped in early on, so I'll just go in order how they arrived. And then, I'll get to yours. We have, I think, a good 10 minutes at minimum, so I should be able to get to all of them that come through. So feel free to hit the Q&A and hit send, please. So first question, what are the best practices you recommend for reducing the overall cost of developing a DR strategy on the cloud versus secondary data center most companies have used in the past? So, that one slide that talks about the advantages, I think if there's one takeaway from this is that you can certainly use third-party products. They work different. There's some that have features where you can keep a smaller system as a target. That would be my number one qualification in any solution, is to look at the target being very small. It's especially important when you have multiple systems, multiple production systems running a landscape. That's going to add up pretty quickly. It's going to scale pretty fast. So make sure that target can be very small. That pilot light, as we refer to it, and AWS refers to it. And then you can scale that up when you ever do tests or do DR. So that's the number one thing I would say. Make sure you can have a small target that only covers the replication, that can receive those logs and those changes. And then you can really capture cost savings. I think that's the big piece. I think the question is focused around cost. Number two here that came in. How does the Protera's Disaster Recovery as a Service work in practical terms? Is the service level agreement based on data volume, recovery time, and other parameters? So it's a good question. So our SLA is based upon the RTO and RPO. So that recovery time, how much data can be lost, and how long the system is going to take to be back operational. That is what our SLA is written to. Now, data volume, how big the system is, how many users, how many changes are occurring, those are all really important considerations we have to do when we build the system. Our standard solution is that we're going to recommend a customer to provide a VPN connection. That's where we'll start. We'll do the proof of concept or the testing through that, the VPN. If for some reason the speed or the connectivity is just not reliable enough from that source system, if it's a customer on-premise environment, then we will look at getting a dedicated network connection. Yet the way that we want to, our first approach is going to be the best performing solution for the least amount of cost. So we would start with the VPN connection as the network carrier, and let's see if that is sufficient. Otherwise, we would change and build a solution that needs it. Number 3, we run SAP in our data center. If we deploy DR systems in the cloud, how does the fallback from DR systems in the cloud to our data center work? Okay, so there's the straight, simple answer is that we would recommend you would build another DR backwards. So you would go from DR and AWS to this original production environment. That's the simplest way to say it. There is some tools, depending upon if you do replication, there's one solution that does it on the VM level, on the hypervisor, that provides some fallback, yet it's being built into the cloud solutions. It does it on-premise, but today I'm not aware of any solution that does that automatically. So I think where we're at today, has to be done as a manual step where you would build DR as a target back to the source. So it's it would take the biggest effort there is around we call reseeding. So to rebuild that base system from a backup, that's going to take some time. You might do it through the internet if your system's less than a terabyte. If it's larger than a terabyte, it might take a few days just to copy the files over and all the data. Again, it would vary depending upon the size of the system. Yet the good thing, especially if you're DR in AWS, is that you're very well protected. So if a DR event occurred in DR in AWS, you want to make sure your backups are in another region so you're protected. The point being there is that you can run in DR and AWS for an indefinite period of time. But obviously, company would want to get back to their production environment because that's where they spent to build all their infrastructure. That it'd be an immediate plan that we would work on. Yet, being in AWS, you're protected, and you could do it in over a few weeks' time. Next question: what key trends do we see around how SAP customers approach DR? Can you share some info on how you see the SAP DR systems evolve? So, yes, this question, I mentioned a little bit about it in the presentation. We see, I can't remember the last customer we talked to that's building another DR site. So right now, any physical sites are going to the cloud. So that's one trend that we certainly will see accelerate, that more and more targets will go into the cloud just for all the features that the cloud provides natively. And then, the other thing we're seeing is that, disaster recovery as a service. This trend, this topic came up a few years ago, where we see the SLA combining that with being able to build systems very, very quickly for test purposes. We certainly see this area of the industry evolving and continuing to grow, using the best parts of cloud essentially to provide even more features, not only in DR but also that copy production, as I mentioned. So certainly, the use case for cloud for DR is very strong. And companies will probably come up with a lot of new ideas here that we'll be seeing shortly. We've certainly innovated our solution over the last 5 years in AWS quite a bit. We provide new features in it. Next question, can Protera DR support the physical on-premise and virtual on the cloud with, for SAP? So it's a good question. There is actually, so I'll answer first what's available in the industry, and there is differing capabilities within, I've seen in third-party products. There's some third-party products that just presume everything's on VMware, so everything's virtualized already, or Hyper-V or OpenStack, one of those flavors of of virtualization. So that could be a showstopper if you're not yet today on VM, not virtualized. It might restrict you with what you can do and how you replicate. As I mentioned, the old tried and true method of replicating the database and the operating system, that works, as long as AWS supports your target. If you're an x86 source, which is Windows or Linux, you should be good. You can always stand by with that. So if you're physical, you can certainly do that replication that way. Next question. Are DR systems on the cloud regionally isolated to protect against regional disasters? Weather events, for example, and in those scenarios, is communication latency an issue? So, yeah, the question pretty much answers the point on they're regionally isolated, right? So as we talked, in AWS, you have many regions, even within the United States, there's 4 regions today. And around the world, there's many, many more. So that is going to provide that regional protection. Now the core question here in this is around latency. So there is going to be marginal latency. If all your users are on the East Coast and that's where production is, and now you're going to the West Coast, if it's a DR failure or you're doing testing, there's going to be a marginal latency in it. I remember this, I do not remember this, but I think it's around 20 milliseconds it might add to go cross-country in the network. The good news is that SAP, with its amazing engineering, they have done a really good job with minimizing the traffic that the SAP GUI uses and the web front end, those web services. So from a standpoint of it really affecting, if latency, it doesn't become a big factor in affecting the time that the data goes to the end user. So latency will be a marginal change, but it doesn't affect users. And that's where, not talking just about DR, one of the really interesting parts about the AWS solution to architect SAP solutions is now they just released in the last few weeks an Ohio region, so the middle of the country. So for a company that has a West Coast and East Coast presence, you could split the performance and put the system in the middle of the country, and everyone have equal response time. It's a marginal change, granted, yet it provides companies that have on-premise data centers today a myriad of choices of where they put that data center, and so they can architect and answer. They have a much more colorful palette of paints to color for their solution. So it's the beauty of AWS Cloud and all the features it provides. Next question, does the DR services require agents to be installed on the production systems for replication? So the short answer is it does not require it. There is some third-party solutions that do use that. So our standard solution does not require it, so you certainly don't need it. So if there's concern by a company that they don't want to put third-party software on it, it is not required. Okay, got 3 more coming in here. We're getting to, I think, the end of the time, so feel free, if you get more, we can go a little longer, but I got 3 more here in the queue. From an on-premise environment, how does DR failover to the cloud and failback work? So yeah, it's the same, similar to what was asked before. The best, especially because this is on-premise and it's the way it's worded, it's not virtualized, that the first solution where we're replicating the database and the logs in the operating system, we're just going to set DR to fail back essentially. So that's the easiest approach for that, to recreate the production environment from DR. Second to last one that came in here is our DR solution SAP certified? And that is certainly the case. So again, going back to the global cert that we just received, and I should mention that we've had the certifications going back to 2008. So the global we just received 2 weekends ago, but we've had the North America certification going back to 2008. So that is part of the SAP certification process. They review our DR practices, the replication tools that we use, how we do backups of the DR solution. So all these things are interrogated, audited, looked at for our services. And again, there's that slide that talked about AWS requirements for support. So it's really important, and we always abide by this, that we have all SAP AWS environments fully supported. So that's another really important part when you're talking DR and AWS, to make sure that you fulfill all the SAP requirements. And then lastly, does our DR solutions integrate or interface with AWS? So I would certainly say yes. It's we have what's built into our standard solution for DR. We have that replication capabilities. We have the capabilities to quickly copy that DR pilot system and create that full landscape, especially if you have an ERP system and CRM, BI, Solman. We replicate that full environment, including any peripheral systems like Active Directory for authentication. Any of the third-party tools, those will be fully replicated. So those are all integrated and interface with AWS. And then we leverage as much as possible any of the new tool sets. So CloudWatch for monitoring, and any of they call CloudFormation. This is some of the automation capabilities AWS provides. We have that built into the solution. So we want to take advantage of all the best features of AWS and bring those to our customers. So thank you for all the Q&A. We got through all of them there. So I'll finish with this slide, and this is around our free assessment. So feel free, reach out to our website. These links you can't click. So the best way is just go to our website, and you can get a free assessment. We have separate webinars that are covering just this area, and we look at how we would look at checking a customer environment to move to HANA on AWS. So this considers all the features, everything you have to look at, and any remediation steps. Also provides a good project plan and an estimate of what the migration and support in AWS would cost. I encourage you to attend our next upcoming 2 webinars. We have one on March 14th, which is going to look at driving efficiency, cost, and minimizing that downtime for the migration. This is where we'll talk about our FlexBridge solution. And on the 21st of March, we're going to talk about companies that are looking to move to AWS for SAP. We're going to be looking at our best practices learned from our customer success stories. So good things coming in March. So please attend that, and look forward to that content coming. I want to thank everyone for their time here today. Very much appreciate it. We're going to be recording this and putting it onto YouTube, so that'll be available very, very shortly. Appreciate everyone's time today, and thank you for attending.